Hey guys, welcome back to the One Piece at a Time Distilling Institute with Alan Bishop. The place where we try to give you the best possible distilling information we can without making complete fools out of ourselves by telling you shit we don't actually know the answer to. So, that being said, today we've got a question from Vladimir Vishnyakov. I think I said that the correct way. If I didn't, I apologize. My cornbread accent often gets in the way. If you've watched any of my videos, you know that. So, he says, "Hey Alan, could you share your opinion regarding the use of enzymes? I have a persistent prejudice that enzymes are not natural, although I know they are, and I have some disgust for them, maybe because they are grown on mold. I also read somewhere that the saccharification with malt gives a larger number of different complex sugars, but enzymes only simple sugars. Thank you. Regards, Vladimir." This is an excellent question, and this is one of those things I've talked about on Distillers Talk many times. I talk about on tours at my commercial distillery all the time, and one of the things that I think sets apart, to some degree, or at least one aspect of this sets apart a true distiller from somebody just playing the role. So the first thing that I will say is enzymes are nothing new to whiskey. Pretty much all the large commercial brands in the United States use enzymes to some greater degree or the other as opposed to barley malt. Now you may not believe that, but here's what I'm going to say to you. One of the thing that I mentioned that sets a true distiller apart from someone just playing a distiller is whether or not they understand the brewing arts to any degree whatsoever. What I mean by that is, can they write a mash bill? Anybody can write a mash bill. You can say 80% corn, 10% wheat, 10% malt. Is that mash bill efficient? In other words, are there enough enzymes from the malt alone to convert the starch into fermentable sugar via alpha amylase and beta amylase? Already there's some of you going, I don't know what the hell he's talking about, and that's okay because you'll get there. We're not going to get into all that today in depth, other than to say that most mash bills that exist out there, even something as simple as 80-10-10, are not terribly efficient, and there are many mash bills that would not be efficient in any way, shape, or form based on the amount of malt that is in them to this day. So writing a mash bill is not as simple as writing down what your percentages are. You got to figure out how you can actually convert that, and whether you can do it traditionally with malt or you have to use exogenous meaning from an outside source, enzymes, to get that conversion. Now, this enzyme thing all started basically from Jokichi Takamine, and I believe he was granted a patent in 1894. He was working for the Whiskey Trust at the time. If you guys aren't familiar with Whiskey Lore, it's a great podcast with Drew Hanish. You should go check it out. He has two of them. There's Whiskey Lore The Interviews, which is interviews with distillers and people in the industry, and then there's Whiskey Lore Stories, which is the one that I absolutely love, where he goes deep into the history of whiskey from around the world and the history therein. And he has an excellent 3-part series about the Whiskey Trust, including Jokichi Takamine, and what the Whiskey Trust was up to. Here's what I will say, the short version of it. The Whiskey Trust was interested in Jokichi Takamine because he figured out this exogenous enzyme thing, which came from koji culture. Koji is a mold that's used often in the East for things like sake and sochu production. It is a mold-derived enzyme that can saccharify and turn starches into sugars that are fermentable. The Whiskey Trust was not interested in Takamine's work because of quality. They were interested in it because of turnover and efficiencies and saving money on malt and not having to either buy or make as much malt and being able to make whiskey very, very quickly. That's the main reason the industry to this day still relies on exogenous enzymes as opposed to mash bills that actually work the way that they were traditionally supposed to work back in the day. Now, does this mean that enzymes can't make good whiskey? No, they certainly can. And for barrel-aged products, they're probably, at least long-aged products, they're probably okay. I will also say this, though. In the Scotch whiskey industry for single malt, and I believe the Irish whiskey industry, you're forbidden from using exogenous enzymes, which is pretty interesting as far as quality is concerned. So, my personal opinion on enzymes. I think they have their place sometimes. I am not personally a fan of them overall, especially not for bourbon production, when they are used as often recommended, which is at 100% efficiency. At 100% efficiency, those enzymes, they can't tell the difference between a starch you actually want to convert to sugar and a starch you don't want to convert to sugar. So anything with starch in it that is in that matrix of grains that you're going to grind and ferment is then going to get turned into alcohol, whether you want it to or not, and it is going to lead to two things: off flavors, because you converted things that you don't want, as well as the complete conversion 100% all the time in every case of all the starches in that matrix, meaning that none of those starches are left behind during the distillation process. It's 100% efficient, but you also lose a lot of aromatic components, because those starch components that would have been left behind by traditional distillation, traditional fermentation, that's not hardly ever 100% efficient, they have aromatic compounds that come across during distillation and make the whiskey more interesting. Remember that 90% of what you taste is in what you smell. Those starch components that come across in that aroma from an inefficient fermentation and distillation, not crazy inefficient, but a little inefficient, add an entirely different dimension to your whiskey. In my opinion, this is one of the biggest differences, with all other differences aside, between, and we'll even say on column distilled spirits, column distilled bourbon whiskey in the United States of America, and column distilled rye whiskey in the United States of America. This is the single biggest differentiating factor between post-prohibition and pre-prohibition as far as quality. If you ever get a hold of a good vintage bottle, it's the amount of starch that was left from fermentation, went through the distillation cycle, and pulled off those aromatic compounds. Now, there are other factors, obviously, water, grain variety, things of that nature, but I think overall this is the biggest difference. Do I use enzymes? Sometimes. I have certain mash bills where I don't have a choice but to use those enzymes. And the reason for that is because I use a lot of brewer's malts in my commercial distillations. So brewer's malts often having a lower diastatic power, a lower ability to convert starch into sugar, or fermentable sugar for fermentation. I use those because a lot of them are roasted to different degrees, or they're treated differently, and so they have their own unique flavor compounds, and they can really change things up. For example, caramel malt's a really great example, which doesn't have very much, if any, real diastatic power left in it. Chocolate malt's another great example. So I need to rely on enzymes to some degree. Now, I have changed up my mash bills in the past several years to better reflect the traditional style of whiskeys that I do prefer, and if the distillery were owned by me, we would be converting everything via malt and nothing via enzyme, one way or the other. It is not owned by me, so I have to color within the lines to some degree, like a lot of other people do in their professions, for better or worse. Now, when I do use enzymes, the one thing I'm lucky enough to have is I work for a company that does let me make those decisions when it comes to quality. So I don't run enzymes at 100% efficiency. I pull them back quite a bit, so we're not getting 100% efficiency, so that I'm still getting those starchy compounds and those aromatics that I want to get to come across. You also said that you read somewhere that saccharification with malt gives a large number of different complex sugars, but enzymes only simple sugars. That I'm not sure, but I would say that that's probably true, because it's breaking everything down to the lowest common denominator to make everything easier on the yeast 100%. For me, exogenous enzymes they're a means to an end with certain mash bills, right? I'll give you another example. There's a company here in my state that claims, well, they've brought back an old name in whiskey distilling, and they claim that their mash bill is blah blah blah, parallel to what the historic mash bill was. 99% corn and 1% malt. Even those of you who haven't gone that deep down the rabbit hole yet should know that 1% malt is not going to convert that mash bill, and that's fine, but it takes exogenous enzymes to get that to work. The same thing with 100% corn whiskey. Unless you're actually going to malt all of that corn to make 100% corn whiskey, you're going to need exogenous enzymes. That's the nature of the beast. Not everything that sounds like a good idea is a practical idea. So I think that I've fairly well cleared that up. I do think there's a qualitative difference. There's also a quantitative difference. Now, the big distilleries, if they don't get 100% efficiency, they lose a lot more product in a distillation run than a distillery my size does. There's a big difference between 10 or 15 barrels and 10 or 15 gallons of product. So bear that in mind as well. Guys, as always, if you have any questions, bishopshomegrown@gmail.com, any of my social media, or the YouTube comments. Love y'all. Have a good one. Later.